Hey guys, I hope everyone is doing well. I want to take some time here. Hopefully, as you watch this, you will correct your study guides or add to as needed, just like when we would go over them in class together. So, nothing's changed. You're just listening and correcting or adding to as needed. Okay? So, I want to review um, part one of your study guide for World War II. We started World War II while we were still in school. We've been doing things the past month virtually, and I put together this review so that we could get all that information in one place because we still have to talk about World War II in the Pacific. So we still have some stuff to cover with World War II, which we'll wrap up hopefully next week. Okay, and then you will have a test here either next week or the following week virtually. Okay, so let's start talking about our important leaders and generals that we talked about. So these individuals would have been in your Rise of the Dictators or Rise of the Allies notes that we took. And I also uploaded these presentations to Classroom so that you have access to the full presentation in case you didn't have your notes. So on Google Classroom, everything you need for World War II has been uploaded. Okay. So first, Francisco Franco. He was the fascist leader of Spain, and remember, fascist leaders, they're not very nice to their people. They want total control. He was helped into power by Adolf Hitler and I'm sorry, that should say Italy and Germany, Hitler and Mussolini, due to the fact that they wanted him to stay out of the way, right? If someone is along the same party lines as him, them, Hitler and Mussolini, then it would be easier for them to do what they wanted to do. So once Franco's in power, he stays out of the way. You have to remember he is right, Spain is right next to France, right next to France is Germany, right below is Italy. So Spain is pretty close to all that was going on during World War II in Europe. So during World War II, because of Franco's power and help from Mussolini and Hitler, Spain stays neutral throughout World War II. Okay. Mussolini. Okay. As you remember, hopefully, he was also called El Duce, another fascist leader who came to power because he told his people he was going to revive the Italian economy. He was going to restore glory to the Roman Empire. Same as Adolf Hitler. He really spoke to his people and appealed to the people. And that's a big part of how these fascist leaders, these dictators, come to power. Okay. Adolf Hitler, we know as our Nazi party leader from Germany, also called the Fuhrer. He uses the Jewish people as scapegoats for essentially any problem he could come up with or think of. He published his book Mein Kampf when he was in jail before he becomes Chancellor of Germany, so the late 1920s. And he leads Germany into World War II. Stalin is our communist leader from Russia. He institutes his 5-year plans to industrialize Russia. Before Stalin comes to power, Russia is not a very industrialized nation. So Stalin comes up with these 5-year plans where during this 5 years, this is going to happen to industrialize the nation. The next 5 years, this is what's going to happen to industrialize the nation. So you can imagine that the first couple 5-year plans of his were very industrial to the point of war goods, tanks, war thing, planes, anything that you would need to fight a war. Okay. Tojo. He is our military general in charge of Japan's military, and you have to remember that Japan is militaristic, so they are controlled by their military. We also had Emperor Hirohito, who is technically the head of Japan, but Hirohito kind of takes a back seat. He's still seen as the emperor, still looked upon as the emperor, but Hideki Tojo is really in charge when it comes to Japan and the war. So Tojo also invades Manchurian China because of their iron and coal supplies before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So just like Hitler, Japan is also making moves before the war actually starts. They're invading Manchurian China. Hitler's going for the Sudetenland and Austria and the Rhineland. So powers in Europe are making moves. Okay, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he kind of picks sides, right? We're supposed to be isolationists. We're supposed to be neutral. We're not supposed to be choosing a side. Franklin Roosevelt supports England. We have the Lend-Lease Act, which we're going to talk about. He's our active leader up until kind of the very end of World War II when he passes away. But remember, that's a big part. We are supposed to be neutral. Roosevelt chooses sides once we start supporting Great Britain. Okay. Eisenhower, he leads our invasions in North Africa and then up through Italy. He is Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe and helps plan that big D-Day invasion. So before we even get to Europe, we go to fight in North Africa and Italy first. That is the first place US troops go. Stalin is not very happy with this. Stalin wanted us to come to Europe first because he figured if the US troops come and fight Germany first, then that's going to pull the Germans away from Russia. But that's not where we went first. So Stalin was not very happy that we go to North Africa first. But Eisenhower, or Ike as he's sometimes called, is in charge of our North African and Italy invasion. Okay. Patton, probably another name you've heard of. He leads Operation Torch as well, which is the invasion of North Africa. And he also then goes to Europe and has a large part of the D-Day invasion. MacArthur, he is our guy in the Pacific. So starting tomorrow and finishing up, we're going to talk about the war in the Pacific, and Douglas MacArthur is the guy that we're going to be talking about most when it comes to leaders. He is in charge of the U.S. forces in the Pacific, and he is the one who is there when Japan officially signs their surrender. Churchill, he is the British leader. After Chamberlain thought he appeased Hitler, came home, said he made peace for our time, and it doesn't turn out that way because Hitler's still making moves. So when Chamberlain resigns, Churchill comes in, and he had been warning everybody about Hitler, about Germany and what they were doing. So in 1940, he becomes England's prime minister. So he will lead them through World War II. Bernard Montgomery was the commander of the British 8th Army. He led the British forces through North Africa and up into Italy. He was also in charge of the ground forces for D-Day for the Allies. So Montgomery is kind of your equal to what our Eisenhower or Patton would have been. Now, Charles de Gaulle, okay, he was France's commander of the French troops. Now you have to remember, France falls very quickly to Germany. Okay, so de Gaulle refuses to accept France's surrender. There is a part of France that is considered Free France, and that is what we call Vichy France. So de Gaulle goes to Vichy France and kind of tries to get the French back up and fighting, but kind of all to no end until the United States joins the war. France is out of it. So even though France has fallen, Charles de Gaulle is still very active in trying to defeat Hitler and the Germans. Okay. So those are big people that I wanted us to hit on. So again, those can be found in your Rise of the Dictators, Rise of the Allies notes. So let's talk about appeasement. Okay, at the end of World War I, we had the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ends the war. Okay, and there were some really big things that came out of that treaty, and you have to remember that nobody from the losing side was invited, nobody was asked, it was forced upon them. So first and foremost, Germany had to sign the war guilt clause, right? They had to accept blame for World War II. They had to pay $30 billion in reparations, meaning war fees, right? They had to pay all these countries. Well, that's a big problem when you have no money, when you're a war-torn country and you have lost everything. They had to give up colonies, territories that they had conquered. So they have to leave Poland. They have to, what is now Poland, they have to pull out of France. They have to leave all of these territories. They also have to demilitarize, right? They have to break down planes, tanks, guns. They have to scrap everything. They can only have a standing army of 100,000 men, leaving them angry. They feel vulnerable, right? And they also have to leave the Rhineland. Now remember, the Rhineland is that industrial area on the border of France and Germany. So they have to leave the Rhineland, they have to demilitarize, give up territory, pay money they don't have. Remember, it takes them till 2010 to pay off their World War I debt. Okay, and a lot of them had problems too because they had to accept full guilt for a war that they technically did not start. Okay. Appeasement is the policy of making concessions in order to avoid a conflict. So this is what Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain tried to do with Hitler when Hitler starts making his very first moves with the Rhineland and the Sudetenland. He gives him what he wants, right, in order to avoid going to war. Hitler claimed that he needed this territory, this space for Lebensraum, and that's just this idea that he needed more living space for his people, that he was expanding Germany for his people, for living space. Okay. So let's talk about some of these first moves that Hitler starts to take when he becomes chancellor in 1933. He starts slowly violating the Treaty of Versailles year by year. So all of these things that he's not supposed to be doing, he starts doing. And nobody stops him. Nobody says, you can't do that, because they're trying to appease him, right? They're trying to give him what he wants so as not to avoid, so as not to start another war. Nobody wanted to go to war again. Okay, so in 1935, he begins secretly rebuilding the German military. Well, under the Treaty of Versailles, they had to demilitarize. They were no longer allowed to have a military over 100,000 men. So that was a big violation. In 1936, he remilitarizes the Rhineland, which he sends troops to occupy that Rhine River area on the French-German border. He's right at France at this point. He's not allowed to do that. As part of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to leave the Rhineland. They're not allowed to be there. 1938, we have two big things that happen. Okay, one is the Anschluss, which is Hitler's action to take Austria by force, essentially annexing Austria and making it a part of Germany. Now, remember, Hitler was born in Austria. He's Austrian, not German. So that was a big part, a big push for him to want Austria and make it part of Germany. He felt a connection to Austria. So the Anschluss forces Austria to enter into a union with Germany, and Austria at this point is technically a part of Germany. We also had the Sudetenland, which was that top part of Czechoslovakia that borders on Germany. Now, this is where the German-speaking portion of Czechoslovakia was. You had about 3 million ethnic Germans living in the Sudetenland, but it was a very, very industrial part of Czechoslovakia, which was also a push for Hitler to take that. He claimed and this is when he's talking to Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain, that the Sudetenland, if he got it, would be it. That's all he wanted. Okay, so at the Munich conference, you have leaders from France, England, Italy who are discussing this, and they allow Hitler to annex the Sudetenland in order to appease him and avoid this war. So up until 1938, Hitler has done whatever he wanted with no one putting their foot down, nobody stopping him, nobody saying no. In 1938, they believed that, like Hitler had said, he was done. That was all he wanted. And then in 1939, World War II officially begins when Hitler invades Poland. So the invasion of Poland is the official start of World War II. And at this point, everybody knows he cannot be trusted. This is when Winston Churchill comes in and replaces Chamberlain. Okay. Blitzkrieg. This is German for lightning war. This was Hitler's tactic of an overwhelming combination of air attack. So you would have your planes in the air, and you would also have your tanks, your troops on the ground, and you would strike quickly. You would bomb, you would go in on the ground, and you'd be able to take towns very quickly this way. You're essentially overpowering the opposition. During this first part of World War II, because remember it starts in 39, we don't enter till 1941, we're practicing isolationism. Okay, but are we really? Because you have to keep in mind who President Roosevelt has decided to aid. So isolationism is avoiding involvement in foreign affairs and wars. Let's see, we have the Non-Aggression Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet Pact, as you'll sometimes hear it called, which was an agreement between Hitler and Stalin. Hitler convinced Stalin that if Stalin stayed out of his way, he would not invade Russia, that Stalin would never have to worry about Hitler trying to invade Russia, and that Hitler would give Stalin some of these conquered territories that he wanted. Stalin, thinking this is a good idea and he wouldn't have to worry about Hitler invading Russia, signs this agreement and believes that he is in an alliance with Hitler. But we know that doesn't last for long. Just like World War I, Germany surprises France. France once again has their defenses at the Maginot Line, which is that border between France and Germany, where they line their defenses. This is where the majority of their troops were. During World War I, Germany sneaks through Belgium. World War II, the Germans sneak through a forest that the French didn't think they could get through. But the Germans totally bypass the Maginot Line and they move through the forest. And within 10 days, they're pretty much in Paris and have France. So very quickly, similar style to World War I. The Luftwaffe is the German Air Force. Let's see, Enigma was the encryption machine that Germany used. So Germany would code or encrypt its messages, its whatever it was sending out to the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. And once Enigma was cracked by the Allies, by the British specifically, that allowed the Allies to know where the Germans were planning to attack, where they were moving their troops, what their plans were. So Enigma became a really, really crucial part to winning the war. Operation Barbarossa is when Hitler officially breaks that non-aggression pact, that Soviet-Nazi pact, and invades the Soviet Union. So he had promised Stalin he wouldn't, and he does. Okay. So let's move on to 1941. Okay. The event that finally breaks us out of our isolationism, out of our neutrality, is the attack on Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. At this point, there's no avoiding it. We have been attacked on our own soil, as Hawaii is part of the United States. So in between the West Coast, and Japan is the Atlantic Ocean. So the Atlantic Ocean was crucial to the United States. Defeating Japan was crucial, and we needed to control the seas. If we weren't able to control the seas, we would not be able to deliver soldiers. We would not be able to deliver supplies to Japan, to the Philippines, to these places that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So the Battle of the Atlantic was important because we had to control the seas. If we didn't control the seas, we were subject to air attacks, to submarine attacks, torpedo attacks. So the Atlantic, very important, as was the Pacific. The Atlantic, is between the East Coast and Europe. The Pacific is between the West Coast and Japan. My fault. So the Atlantic, very important. The Pacific, very important. We have the Japanese on our west side, and we have Germany and the rest of Europe on the east side. So the Germans also, new to World War II, started to hunt, as you could say, in wolf packs. So in World War I, we talked about U-boats, which are those smaller submarines. In World War II, they used them to hunt together in groups. And what these wolf pack submarines, U-boats, would do is they would often attack at nighttime. So that was something that the Allies really had to focus on and be aware of when they were in the Atlantic. And the breaking of the Enigma code allowed them to know where their submarines were, where to avoid. So that was a really big key piece to safely getting our troops to Europe. Going back, just as a reminder, the Good Neighbor policy, and this was in one of your learning targets, was an agreement with President Roosevelt in Latin America, and just the relationship to encourage them as equals, to treat them as equals. Our Neutrality in Wartime Acts, the Neutrality Act of 1935 stated that we would not provide loans to any nations at war, meaning Great Britain. So if at this point, if anybody needed our help, but they were at war, we would not help them. Now, come 2 years later, we have the Neutrality Act of 1937, also the Cash and Carry Act, so things are heating up a little bit. We ban weapon sales to Spain at this point, and we say that we would provide war goods as long as they were paid for in cash and they were picked up in American ports. So as long as a country like Great Britain, say, could provide cash, they could pay for cash what they needed, and they could come get them, they could have them. We also had the Destroyers for Bases deal, which was an agreement with Great Britain that gave Great Britain 50 of our aging battle destroyers. And in exchange, we received 99-year leases on 8 British bases in the Western Hemisphere. So what this does is it gives us strategic locations in the Western Hemisphere if needed. The Lend-Lease Act takes the cash and carry and takes it one step further, and that allows the U.S. to send weapons to Great Britain regardless of their ability to pay. So you can see that starting in 1935, we're not doing anything for people at war. 1937, we're going to help you if you can pay for them and come get them. And then finally with the Lend-Lease Act, we'll give them to you. It doesn't matter if you can pay for them, and it doesn't matter if you can get them. We will send them to you. You can pay us later. So things are happening pretty quickly in the late 1930s. The Atlantic Charter was an agreement with FDR and Neville Chamberlain, who is the leader of Great Britain, before Churchill, and they proclaim their shared goals that the United States and Great Britain are both opposing Hitler. They're taking a stance here that Hitler is their enemy, and anyone who is his ally is also. So Pearl Harbor happens, and the United States immediately starts mobilizing, meaning we are assembling, we're making soldiers ready for war, we're getting supplies ready for war. We as a nation are mobilizing. Women are going to work in factories. Typically, these jobs had only been open to men before. They're also planting victory gardens. They're doing whatever necessary now that the majority of men are going off to war. The Office of Price Administration is the administration that rations things. So they limit the availability of essential items like meat, sugar, coffee, fuel, shoes, because shoes needed rubber, and canned foods needed metal. Fuel is needed to fight a war effort. All of these items were needed to fight the war. So in order to get things, you got a small amount, and you were required to have a ration coupon for that. So things were limited. War bonds, we talked about this in World War I. They're sold by the government in order to finance the war. It was a way for Americans to show support for the war effort, and also helped with inflation in the United States. So buying a war bond was a way to, if you could not physically go over and fight, to support the war effort, to show you were supporting the war effort. Our victory gardens, these are gardens that were grown by everyday American citizens, whether you were young, old, a child, no matter where you lived, people were doing this. They were growing them at their homes. They had schools, churches, rooftops. If you could grow plants out of a windowsill, people were doing that, all to help with that food effort, all to help with the rationing that was going on. If we had starving troops, they wouldn't be able to fight as good as if they had full bellies. The War Production Board. This board guided our factories into what we needed for the war, what we had to make. So they really oversee that transition between our consumer economy and our wartime economy, switching from producing consumer goods to wartime goods. Okay. Rosie the Riveter, she was just our fictional image of a woman, and she's, flexing her muscle, and she's looks like she's working in a factory, and this was all to try to get women to want to join the war effort, to take on these roles in the factories that we needed them to. We needed to be producing. Propaganda, as you know, was used to promote all kinds of things. People buying war bonds, people conserving food and materials, to stay focused on the war effort, okay, to keep people engaged, to keep people wanting to support, to keep them working, to keep them giving money to that effort. Our African Americans are still segregated during World War II. You guys read about the mess attendant. It's Pearl Harbor, who was able to shoot down some enemy planes during the Pearl Harbor attack, and it was surprising because he wasn't trained to do that, right? African Americans are still segregated. They're not allowed to be in fighting positions at this point, so that was a pretty impressive story. Japanese Americans, also a group that were highly discriminated against during this. Remember, the Japanese are the ones who bombed Pearl Harbor. So President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, and what this does is it creates internment camps. Think about concentration camps. Okay, these are prison camps that we are putting Japanese Americans in. The conditions are not pleasant. They're dirty. They're living in little shacks. They don't have privacy. They have to leave their homes. They have to leave their jobs. Many Japanese Americans lost everything. And they're also under close watch by guards at all times. Many of these people were American citizens. Many of them were born in the United States. They were American. But there was just this fear of, could they be trusted? Were they spies for Japan? And because of this Think about the Red Scare with that scare of communism. The same thing with Japanese. It wasn't known if they could be trusted. So Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066. And this is all in the West. So you have to remember the West is where most Asians are immigrating from. They're coming into Angel Island from Japan, from China, the Philippines. Okay. The Zoot Suit Riots, if you've ever heard the song, this is what it's from. We had our sailors who were stationed in Los Angeles, and there was tension between Latin American youths during a horrific week of violence because the sailors believed that these flashy suits that these young Latin American men like to wear, and you had a picture there in the presentation, were too flashy, and there was so much fabric, and they were big, and that they were not doing their part for the war effort, that they weren't rationing, they weren't being supportive, and the Zoot Suit riots ensued. Okay. Let's see. Let's move to the war in North Africa and Europe. We're almost done here. Okay. So North Africa is important because the British needed to ship oil that is crucial for fighting a war for the Allies, for France, for Great Britain, eventually for the United States, to protect it against the Italians. So the Italians are going for it. Eventually, the Italians are going to start struggling, so Hitler's also going to send German troops to North Africa. And this is why the United States goes to North Africa first. This is a lifeline, and if we could not get that oil, we would not be able to effectively fight a war. Okay. Operation Torch is the invasion of North Africa. Tuskegee Airmen were segregated units of African American pilots. They were actually the first ever to be trained by the U.S. military, so that was a big step, even though they were still segregated. Operation Overlord is the D-Day invasion of Normandy, France. So just kind of that upper part of France that is across from Great Britain. Battle of the Bulge. Now, you often hear about Battle of the Bulge, and this was Hitler's last-ditch attempt at an offensive. By this point, the Allies had pushed the Germans back towards Germany, out of France, and they kept pushing. So Hitler's last-ditch attempt at pushing the Allies back was the Battle of the Bulge, and it's called the Battle of the Bulge because the Germans are able to, for a short time, push the Allies back, and it creates a bulge in the line of the Allied defenses. So, for no other reason than it creates a bulge in the line of Allied defenses, is it called the Battle of the Bulge. So the Germans do temporarily push the Allies back until the Allies are able to get some help, and then the Germans are once again pushed back towards Germany and out of France. Okay. All right. So what we have left on our study guide is the Holocaust. And let's start with talking about anti-Semitism. And that is simply the hostility toward prejudice against hatred of Jews. So oftentimes you'll hear anti-Semitism or anti-Semite, all the same thing. The Aryan race was this mythical German superior race, and it was found in German folklore. This is nothing that Hitler just pulled out of his back pocket. This had been found in a lot of German folklore before, so it was nothing that the people weren't used to. This hatred of the Jewish people and blaming them was also part of that German folklore, so it was nothing new. It's just something that Hitler picks up and plays on and feeds off of. The Nuremberg laws are the first set of laws that strip Jews of their German citizenship. It takes away pretty much all of their civil rights, their economic rights. So think about people who owned businesses, Jewish people who owned businesses. your civil rights, your basic human rights, your ability to own a home, to own a business. And it also defines who's a Jew and who's an Aryan German. So here we have the breakdown of you're a German, you're a Jew, you are no longer considered German. Kristallnacht, you guys did a reading on this, so this should be familiar to you, but it's translated as the Night of Broken Glass, and this is the first big attack of the Nazis against the Jewish people. They're burning homes, they're burning businesses, they're burning synagogues, throwing bricks through store windows, destroying anything they could that was Jewish owned. The Nazi SS, this was Hitler's feared police and military forces. They were very brutal to the Jews. They carried out Kristallnacht. They carried out a lot of terror activities. They would be ones at the concentration camps as well as the ghettos and the extermination camps. So the ghettos were rundown neighborhoods in a city where Jews and other groups of people, your gypsies, your homosexuals, people that Hitler did not like, would also be placed in these ghettos, and you were forced to live in. So you might have 3 million people living in 1 or 2 city blocks because that's where they're forced to live. So very, very bad conditions, very little food. Your family probably lived in one small apartment room. Very, very tough situations, and you weren't allowed to leave. Concentration camps are technically the work prisons. So concentration camps and extermination camps are 2 different things. So that's important to understand. Concentration camps were work prisons. Now the idea being that, well, you might work the Jew to death, but it was not specifically an extermination camp. Okay? The concentration camps, they weren't gassing the Jews. But not just the Jews, others who Hitler considered enemies were also put into these camps. Closer to the end of the war, you have this idea of genocide, of systematically destroying all Jews, and this is where we get the final solution. And that was put in place in order to accomplish the genocide of the Jewish people in Europe, and that is when you have the establishment of extermination camps. Extermination camps were the camps where people would get off the trains, and most of them were murdered within an hour of arrival. They would separate them into groups who looked like they might be able to work. They would separate mothers and children and fathers and families, and they would be put into the gas chambers. So the extermination camps are a little different than the concentration camps. Now, at the end of the war, we hold the Nuremberg trials, and they are in Nuremberg because Nuremberg was the first place where Jews were essentially stripped of all of their rights. So there is a connection there. And the Nuremberg trials were Nazi trials. Nazis put on trial for their war crimes and their roles at the end of the war. So not every single Nazi was put on trial, but your big leaders were, and you guys did the juror simulation where you read, I think I had 6 of the big players who were leaders or were in charge or did specific things. Those are the individuals who went on trial. Okay, so that wraps up the study guide. Okay. Please let me know either via email, Google Classroom, if you have any questions or need anything clarified. I'm more than happy to help. Okay. I do want to go over your major turning point battles in World War II very quickly as well, so that we can move on to the Pacific and wrap up World War II. Okay, so you guys just briefly read about the Battle of Stalingrad, Battle of Midway, Alamein, the invasion of Italy, and the invasion of Normandy, which is D-Day. So, Italy is invaded by the British and American troops in 1943. Okay, right here, British and American forces land in Sicily and advance into mainland Europe, and Hitler is forced to divert troops to Italy to fight the Allied advance. So at that point, Mussolini's troops aren't doing so hot, and Hitler knows that, and he has to pull troops from France and send them to Italy to help in that fight. The Germans, how were the Germans defeated at Stalingrad? The Russian army was able to hold off the German advance long enough for the harsh Russian winter that the Germans were not ready for. They didn't have the clothes, they didn't have the boots, they didn't have the food. So weather and the Russian winter is what allowed the Russians to finally defeat the Germans at Stalingrad. They had such high casualties, the German, simply because troops were freezing to death. They were starving. There were mass casualties on both sides, but eventually the Germans, they were not able to continue. Okay. The Battle of Midway is considered to be a turning point in the Pacific because it's the first time that the Japanese are defeated by American forces. The United States Navy sinks 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and destroys hundreds of planes. This is big for the United States. Japan is defeated for the first time by the U.S. with the Battle of Midway. So there's a newer movie, Midway, out too, if you're interested in that. How did the invasion of Italy affect Hitler's Germany? So the invasion of Italy forces Hitler to divert those troops, and that allows the Allies to gain an advantage in the rest of Europe. If Hitler's pulling troops away from France and from Russia to fight in Italy, that means there's less of a force there, and it allows the Allies to gain advantage in Europe because of him having to pull so many troops from there. Okay. And the fifth question is your opinion. Why do you think the invasion of Normandy came so late in the war? So I will be interested to see what you guys came up with for that. Okay. So that is all I have for you. On Friday, you can look for the first part of the War in the Pacific notes, and you'll have a little activity, and then we will wrap up with that next week. Okay, so everybody have a good day, stay healthy, I miss you all, and see you soon.